Good evening, everyone. Have a PS4 Pro here. The customer decided to take apart to clean and ripped the power connector off the board right there. It's hard to see here, but there used to be a connector there. We'll have a look at it under the microscope. So as you can see here, there is no longer a connector. And luckily, two of the main power pads are still intact somewhat. They're still connected to the vias. So we'll be able to reuse those, but the other two pads are completely ripped off, and the ground plane mount is also ripped off, so I'm going to have to rebuild that. I have a couple of tricks up my sleeve to get that fixed using stuff that we already have, and it works pretty good. So here we have the connector. This is the connector the customer supplied to me. Luckily it wasn't destroyed in the process. So I'm going to try to remove the old pads that came off the board with it and clean it up a bit so we can reuse it. I'm putting a little flux here to help flow things and knock these old pads off. So making a little bit of progress here. I really need 3 hands. Alright, 2 mounting base pads are gone. Those are what ripped off the ground plane. That's what held that was what secured the connector down for the most part. And the rest of these are just the small pads that came off the board. Now I'm just going to rake my iron across here to just kind of reflow the solder a little bit, so we don't have any big blobs on there. And there we go. We have the connector ready to be placed back on, completely intact. I was really surprised that it wasn't damaged. So now here what I'm doing is I'm scraping the ground plane around where the connector was so I can create a place to solder to. Essentially, since the ground plane is missing off the connector, I have to scrape off the coating off the board, the green coating, in order to get to the bare copper so I can put some solder down and essentially build a bridge across that so the connector will have something to mount to and secure it. Here's a better view of it. You can kind of see here what I was doing. I'm basically just scraping it down to the copper. Scraping off these little vias here. These are the small little, what's left of the traces that went to those 2 larger pads on the left that are missing. scraping that off down to the copper so I can solder some enameled wire to it. So this wire that I have kind of stripped off some of the enamel off of it whenever I do eventually place it down, so it'll at least be conductive where I'm soldering it. So here, what I'm actually going to use is some used up wick, um, and the reason I figured that would be good is because something I already have, obviously, and essentially I usually just throw this stuff away, but I have a decent amount of it, and to me, as long as it's saturated with solder, it becomes hard. And makes it rigid. So to me, if I cut off a piece of it, I can use that to build a bridge across here off this ground plane to give a good solid mounting surface. So um, here I'm just tinning up the little pads that I kind of scraped here to give it something to solder to. Excuse my shaky hand here. And a little bit of flux just to help things flow nicely. And here we go. Just going to flow it a little bit and let everything get nice and hot. And it should be secure. There we go. Testing it on the top and the bottom, it's pretty solid. So now we have a good solid piece that we can reattach the original connector in its original location, essentially. It'll be a little bit raised up off the board more than before, but I mean that doesn't really matter, because when I put these pads back for the actual connections, those can be raised up just a little bit. It's no big deal. As long as there's a good solid connection to them and it has a good solid base, it'll work just fine. So now I'm going to kind of move these pads, kind of hold them down because they're folding up. I don't want to hit them with the iron and damage them, so holding them down here, and just so I can get this other pad soldered down. It's a little too close to that left pad, so I'm going to kind of move it a little to the right. That should be good. And check it, nice and solid. Looks like I'll need to probably add a little bit more solder to that top left corner, but that's alright. It's still pretty solid, and I gotta add more solder to it anyways when I put the connector back on. So now here, adding a little more flux for the small traces I have to rebuild with some wire. Essentially all I'm going to do here is, well, if I can get it to attach. Alright, seems to be pretty well attached there. So now I'm going to bring that wire down, and then I'm going to loop it back around like so. I got a little too much solder on the actual wire itself. It doesn't bend quite as easily, but it'll be alright. I like to bend it down and fold it like this because it gives it just more surface area to solder to the connector. So now both sides of the wire are connected here. And now it's on to the next one. Alright, just breaking off this little extra piece here. And I'm going to touch it up. It looked like it may have been a little bit loose. I'm going to touch it up with some more solder here, just to make it extra strong. There we go. Alright. Alright, now we're attaching the second wire. This is being a little difficult. Oh, come on. Alright, there we go. And now we'll fold this one over just like we did the other one. We want to make sure that the wire looped back around remains within the pad area, and the very end of it is a little bit larger than the rest, just so that's where, because that's where actually the pin of the connector is going to solder to. So we kind of want to give a decent loop at the end where the solder can flow to. And I cannot get this for the life of me. There we go. Alright. Fiddle around with that for a minute. Finally got it. Both wires soldered on the same pad. Now that that's secure, I just kind of bend it into place. And now I'm just going to kind of tin the very end a little bit. Kind of scrape it too. Kind of exposes the copper. Alright, now to get rid of the rest of it. Here you can tell this pad on the left is connected to the ground plane. You can tell that it was connected up there, but it tore off. So what I'm going to do is kind of scrape the coating off, the green coating up above it there. And I'm going to expose the copper here, and I will tin that a little bit, kind of create a solder bridge. and that'll kind of secure that pad again back down to the board. A little bit of flux. And a little bit of solder. And here, I'm going to have to hold it down because it keeps trying to spring back up. But here, once I create a nice little solder bridge across there, that should hold it down. So this pad on the right, that one is your positive. As you can tell, it was never intended to be connected to the ground plane. So that one is just going to have to float for now. But once we put that back and solder it to the actual connector, the connector is just going to be what keeps that trace from, moving around. It's still secured at the bottom, so I'm not worried about that. So now I'm just cleaning up, trying to clean off the flux and residue with some isopropyl alcohol. And get it ready for applying some conformal coating. And down the corner, you can't see it, kind of out of camera view, but I actually got a little bit of solder down there on the ground plane. I'm just taking that away. So it's irritating when I do that, but at soldering iron, sometimes that tip is pretty large for surface area, but sometimes I forget that, I get too close to something that I can solder, and it just gets on there. And once it's on there, it's on there, and oh well, it doesn't hurt anything. It just is an eyesore. So here I'm just adjusting these just a little bit. So now I have some conformal coating. This is essentially gonna kind of secure the wires and stuff. And when I applied this, I put way too much. So I know somebody's gonna be thinking this whenever they see this video, but yes, I know I put way too much conformal coating. So that syringe, if you put a little bit of pressure on it and it starts going, it just keeps going. Like it'll keep oozing out of there. And a lot of times I have to pull the plunger back out in order to get it to stop flowing out. It's kind of annoying. But yeah, I got way too much here. You're supposed to usually only have just a very thin coating and just enough of a coating to secure, things in place. I use it here to secure those wires so they can't really move around a lot. Once it's actually cured with a UV light, but it also covers up any exposed surfaces, copper or anything like that, to prevent any sort of corrosion or anything. But yeah, I put too much. It took a while to cure, and it is what it is. But it's good stuff to use. Now I just got to scrape off the layer on top so I have a place to solder to. I have a little 10-watt UV light that I use to cure this. It runs for about 10 seconds, and as you can see here, it's still not cured all the way down inside because it's too thick. So I'll probably run it underneath the cure light a few more times just to try to solidify it some more. But anyways, I have a 10-watt light that I use. It runs for 10 seconds, and it usually will cure a thin layer within 10 seconds, but since I have it extra thick here, it'll take much longer to make that hard. So I'll run it under there a few more times off camera. You won't really see it. So now I'm just kind of test fitting where it's going to go just to see how it looks, and everything looks to be okay and lining up like it should. So what I'm going to do first is mount the connector to these new pads that I have, mounting pads on the ground plane, and add a little bit of flux on the left and solder the base of that connector to it, and that should give it a nice, strong, solid foundation. Heck, there's probably a chance it may be even stronger than it originally was, because the original ground plane is just, thin copper. This is much thicker and kind of covers more area, so probably is a little bit stronger than how it was factory. But this connector gets ripped off all the time. If you just go on YouTube and look, you'll see that this is a pretty common mistake that gets made. This one, a customer was taking it apart and they were trying to clean it because it was full of dust, and the fans were running more than they should at high RPM, and so they took it apart themselves to just try to clean it all out, get the dust out of the heatsink and everything. And this connector, for whatever reason, is just notorious for getting ripped off. I think whenever people attempt to take it off, they grab the entire base and pull, and not just the connector that comes out, and so it just rips the whole thing off. So anyways, so here I got both sides soldered down. It seems to be pretty good and solid. Now we have a good base to go by. And now we can kind of get things adjusted around and get kind of close, so we can start soldering the pins. I had a little bit of flux here just to help things flow a bit better. So it looks like the two right hand pads are soldered down pretty good, but I'm going to come back with the tip of this iron and add a little bit more just to be extra sure. Alright. Looks like all 4 pads seem to be coated in solder, pretty thick. And do a little poke check here. The pin's still gonna move a little bit just because there's no like secured pad to the motherboard anymore. So it's just that wire, so it'll move a little bit. But as long as it's connected to the pad and the trace, that's what matters most. Alright, one more check here. It's pretty solid. I can move the board around with it and it doesn't budge. Here's another angle. You can kind of tell here how things are connected. Give a poke at them just to make sure. It's good. The wires look to be attached. What I'm looking for here is that the pin moves independent of the wire underneath, but it's nice and solid. One final check, and that's it. Anyways, that's the fix. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. And here's another happy customer.